Now, there are 4 manuscript sources from the 18th century that we have. Unfortunately, not a single one is by Bach.
Mm-hmm.
His autograph, clear copy, has disappeared. Went to wrap fish, or who knows.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a tragedy, because violinists have a beautiful presentation copy of his sonatas and partitas for solo violin in his hand. So you can see exactly how he thought about phrasing and bowing and articulation for those pieces. What we have are works by 4 copyists. 2 of them we know, 2 remain anonymous. The earliest one is from the mid-1720s by a student named Johann Peter Kellner, who I believe is an organist, not a string player. And his copy is obviously very rushed. He probably wrote it just to have in his collection for his own use. It's full of inaccuracies, mistakes, omissions, that sort of thing. But it probably is based on a copy in Bach's hand. The next one, from about 1730, is by his wife, Anna Magdalena. It's a much better copy. She had great penmanship. In fact, it's very similar to that of Bach himself. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, it also is subject to a lot of errors and omissions and inconsistencies. As August Wensinger pointed out in his 1950 edition, the thing that perhaps is of most interest to cellists, bowings, is of limited use to us in her edition because it's so inconsistent, and a lot of times the bow and slur markings that she does put in seem not to make sense, or when they do make sense, suddenly they stop, or they start not making sense, or they become intermittent. It's difficult to develop a sort of a sense of an conception of bowing and articulation from either of those copyists. It gives you a great sense of what a string player might typically have done in that period, but in terms of arriving at the definitive version, there's no such thing. The remaining 2 copyist editions date from the late part of the 18th century. And again, they seem to come from a common source, but we can't be sure what that is, whether it was a clear copy in Bach's hand or yet another generation copy. There's no knowing. So cellists generally give the most credence to the Anna Magdalena manuscript, and then Kellner, and then the other 2 in that order. It was Stephen Cates who introduced me to the lute version of the 5th suite in C minor. And that's a really interesting case because we do have a Bach autograph of the lute version. It's in a different key, it's in G, but it's by him, and it does serve to settle a few questions about notes and things like that. So it's a very important resource to have.
Okay, when you compare it to Anna Magdalena's, how close is it? How close is her transcription to his lute version?
Well, of course, in the lute version, it's written for 2 voices. So right away, that's apart from the key difference, it's a very important difference. There are quite a few differences, more similarities than differences, but it's very instructive to look at the differences. And there has been a good scholarly case made for the theory that the lute version actually preceded the cello version, that the cello version was based on the lute version. So that's also quite possible. In any case, like many cellists, I started to incorporate elements of the lute version in my performances of the 5th suite.
What kind of elements would that be? I mean, would you be taking different...
Slightly different rhythms for certain phrases, added notes, fully realized harmonizations in certain cases that are just too delicious to pass up. Things like that. I'm ashamed to have to admit that it took a long time for the historically informed performance movement to make an impact on my consciousness. And probably, like a lot of contemporary string players at the time, talking about the 70s, 80s, we tended to dismiss it as the work of cranks and inferior players who turned to that because they couldn't somehow make the technical grade to become legitimate string players. As I say, I'm ashamed to say that because nothing could be farther from the truth. And I think it was a process of gradually beginning to be aware of wonderfully gifted, accomplished players who were working with Baroque setups, with old bows and gut strings, that I gradually started to become aware that there were some wonderful possibilities there. The single event that really made the scales fall from my eyes was a performance, a fully staged performance of the St. Matthew Passion directed by Jonathan Miller at the Brooklyn Academy of Music.
Mm-hmm.
And this production not only featured players and singers in ordinary street clothes, but the musicians were local, very accomplished historical instrument specialists, and they all played Baroque instruments, and they played them great. So I sat there and I heard the St. Matthew Passion come to life in front of me, played by instruments played with funny convex bows and with gut strings, woodwind instruments that were sort of tangentially related to what we hear these days, but obviously were different. And the sonority was so remarkable to me in terms of its inner rhythmic life that I just leaned forward in my seat and I couldn't get enough of this. It was like a revelation to me, this kind of playing. It was an emphasis on rhythmic playing that I had never heard before. And in hearing that, I understood that this also was an outgrowth of the kind of instruments that they were playing. I could sense this as a player myself, that they were responding to their instruments in a way that brought those opening bars in 12/8 to life, almost as if they were playing a dance suite. I had the feeling that in their hands, the low tension strings and the very soft, springy convex bows that were short made it feel as if these bows wanted to keep playing in the lower half. And any string player knows, modern, Baroque, whatever, that when you play in the lower half, you're going to be wanting to play more off the string, and there's going to be more of a rhythmic element, a kind of very deep down kind of rhythmic inner spring. This cello I'm holding in my hand is a contemporary instrument, and it's set up as most contemporary instruments are, with high tension steel strings. This is a modern style tourte bow, and this is a sort of instrument that I use in playing at Avery Fisher Hall with the New York Philharmonic, where you need to put out a lot of sound. You were competing with the New York Philharmonic brass. It's a big space, it holds almost 3,000 people. So this setup is ideal for a super sostenuto kind of playing. It's great for music like that, big romantic pieces with very long phrases. That's a solo from Swan Lake. It's something I typically might play in my chair as principal of the Philharmonic. You need a lot of sostenuto and projecting power for that. In the example I was just playing in the modern cello, I was using a tourte-style bow, which is what most contemporary players will use, and it has this reverse camber to the stick, so it's shaped like this, even when it's fully tightened. It gives it a lot more elastic power here, and one holds this bow all the way back here, over the frog, And it gives you, because of the fulcrum point, it gives you a lot of torque so that you can play powerfully at the tip. Now, a Baroque bow works differently. As you can see, when this is tightened, it has a positive camber. It's slightly convex, like this. It's under a lot less pressure. The stick is lighter and thinner. There's less hair on it. And it's held not back here, but over here. And in return for giving up the power that you would get from having your fulcrum point here, you get a lot more control because your hand is basically over the string much more frequently. And it gives you a lot more control over detail playing. And that's what really makes the difference in playing a Baroque-style instrument. You need detail, rhythm, and articulation much more than you do with a modern instrument.
Now, how does the amount of hair influence that? I hadn't known that the Baroque bow had less hair on it. What difference does that make as far as your feelings of articulation and getting into the string?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I have a feeling that perhaps, in a strange way, it actually helps to dig out individual bass notes when you have to go down and get low notes, that there's a much more specific contact point with the string. So instead of getting added volume, you get added articulation, which again you need with the gut strings because they're under less tension and they respond a lot more slowly than the steel strings. So the advantage you get with a bow like this is that in a quick movement in Bach, something like this, the individual notes can pop out very easily with a minimum of effort. I'm using a much lighter approach than I would use with a tourte bow on steel strings. You just don't need a lot of strength. What you need is the control that this bow hold and this kind of bow can give you. And then the gut strings will speak with you. They'll give you what you need. If you insist on trying to drag tone out of them the way you would do with a modern cello with steel strings, they're just going to lie down, roll over, and die. They're not meant for that sort of thing. They're meant for a sort of plucking technique with the bow in quick passage work, like the courant I was just playing, or the beginning of the third suite. Now, just to give you a sense of contrast, a traditional way of playing that piece on steel strings with a tourte bow would commonly have been something like this. Very different approach, obviously. It's not that I couldn't play it the way I just did on the Baroque instrument. But perhaps I wouldn't have come to the realization that the music, for me, lives much more vividly that way if I hadn't had the experience of playing it with the Baroque setup. That's how it's been such a tremendous education.